excellent. All right. All right, thank you guys for coming and for being so patient with me. Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. So the title of my talk is Coming Out as West Indians in the 21st Century, Ethnic Identity Formation in the Early Years and Beyond. And I think you might be very curious about even just the title of my talk, Coming Out, right? Because we typically think of that more with the gay and lesbian movement. And I thought of this talk really, that it was really fitting in describing the experiences of West Indian immigrants in the United States, because historically, West Indian immigrants have had what I would consider kind of a coming out moment. So for example, in the early 20s and 30s, when the numbers of West Indian immigrants were quite small, they for the most part just kind of blended with the native black population. Especially given that time that racism was so, was such a, so virulent. And then in the 1960s, with changes in immigration laws, there, just as with other non-white immigrants kind of influx into the United States, West Indian immigrants, I would say this has ushered in more kind of a coming out experience historically, right? And then in 2010, based on my research, what I'll be talking about today is really the experiences of the second generation, the children of immigrants, and their kind of coming out experiences in American society, okay? Before I begin, though, I wanted to just kind of make sure that I clarify certain terms that I'm going to be using in my presentation. So when I talk about ethnic identity formation, I may be talking about a range of things. How, the ethnic label, I am Jamaican, I'm Trinidadian, I'm, Bayesian, or the attachment or importance that someone attaches, associates with that identity. It may be a very important thing to me, and it may not really. It's just a label, right? Whether or not you think of that positively or negatively. And then, the kind of behaviors associated with that. With my research, I'm going to be talking primarily about the first three. And then that, term kind of West Indian. What's interesting about that term is that people from the Caribbean islands actually don't typically identify themselves collectively as West Indians. We usually talk about ourselves as Caribbean. So why am I using this funky term then? Well, really, a lot of times it's easier to, for one, my colleagues use the term West Indian. So for my work to be comparable to them, I use the term West Indian. But they use it in part because I encountered, for example, when I was doing research in New York, whenever I use the term Caribbean, then teachers would always assume I'm talking about Dominicans or Puerto Ricans. And so in some ways, this was a more convenient term for me to distinguish between the Spanish-speaking and English-speaking or French-speaking Caribbean islands. And when I talk about West Indian, I also include Guyana and Haiti. Guyana, which is really in South America, but culturally still associate more with the so-called English-speaking West Indians, as well as Haitians, who a lot of folks may not necessarily include in that bunch, especially being French-speaking, but especially within the second generation, really Haitians, they associate more with us, Afro-Caribbeans, than they would, let's say, Puerto Ricans or Dominicans culturally. Okay, so I include them. And then the term second generation is really children of immigrants born in the United States or those who migrated to the United States at a young age. So kind of, what does it mean? Why study West Indians in the year of the census? What I wanted to do to a certain extent was to summarize a bit of what our last speaker, if you were here, talked about, because I think that it really provides a bit of an overview for the talk that I'm going to be giving today. And one of the things our last speaker talked about were the three primary goals of the census, right? That being kind of comparability over time, why we might pick particular labels, because we want to make sure that if we're comparing apples and apples over time, right? And the other two, social usage. This is how people, when people are talking about blacks, or they may talk, say African American. This is how people talk about themselves. So the census is really just reflecting that. And then self-identification. This is really how people identify themselves, and so we're just going to use those terms. And what he talked about was a lot of times these different purposes sometimes conflict with each other, right? So one of the things that you'll certainly see by the end of my talk is that in terms of the ancestry questions, our speaker talked about some of the groups that were missing, those being Afro-Caribbeans, right? And so if it's really based on kind of social usage or self-identification, it's going to be clear by the end of the talk that the census clearly does not reflect that in terms of this population. What I kind of checked just before I came on, pretty much every other group, Hispanics, Asians, have that broader category and then kind of sub-ethnic categories beneath that, but certainly not for Black immigrants. So that was more kind of as it relates to the census. At this point, I wanted to talk about more its significance for academics, right, and why it may be important to study West Indians. And that is really with the change in immigration laws in the 1960s, there's obviously a huge influx of both Asians and Hispanic immigrants coming into the United States, as well as Black immigrants. But because of the sheer numbers, a lot of the research tends to be focused more on Asian and Hispanic groups, which is perfectly fine. But one of the points, one of the reasons why we need to study West Indian immigrants is really because we can't make assumptions about we can't assume that their experiences are going to be similar to Hispanics and whites, especially because research has shown that these two groups, generally speaking, are more accepted, right, into American society than Black West Indians. And so that's one reason. The second is really that kind of time-honored practice within the US to treat all Blacks as a monolithic group, right? So Black equals African American. And because of that, it tends to then make it easier for us to ignore the distinct experiences of Black immigrants integrating into American society. And then lastly, for those of you who are sociologists may have heard of Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And one of the things he's talked about or theorized about is, well, what's happening to American society now that there's such a huge influx of, non-white immigrants? And one of the things he's talked about is that the United States is moving more towards a Latino, Latin American model of race, where there's kind of more of a triracial than biracial. Right? And so in this model, one of the things he talks about is this development of some immigrant groups moving more towards assimilating with whites, and then this collective Black group forming that are maybe more stigmatized. And so one of the real implications from my research then is to think about what does this collective Black group look like, and what is the implications of this for how we define Blackness in the US. So with that as a context, this particular talk is really going to focus on the experience of ethnic identity formation over time, and really looking at how family, peers, and early schooling experiences shape that simultaneously. I'm going to try to go through the theoretical piece a bit quickly, but one of the things that immigration scholars talk about is that the experiences of immigrants into the United States is really shaped by social context. So it makes a difference whether, for example, you're assimilating, as Chinese if you're in California versus Boston, right? And so in this case, I'm going to be focusing on Brooklyn, New York, which is really kind of, the place where West Indian immigrants are the most highly concentrated. I'm also going to be looking at schools, and one of the things that immigration scholars talk about is that really this is an important context within which identity formation takes place. And for Black immigrants, the assumption is that because they're Black and typically concentrated in inner city areas, that they're going to be pressured to identify as African American in these predominantly Black schools. What's interesting about the study that I conducted is that I focused on schools where the majority of the Black kids were Afro-Caribbean, not African-American. Just trying to think of a way to kind of move on because of the lateness. Just kind of thinking though about the literature and what other folks have found, because it's important, is that there tends to be a relationship between the social class backgrounds of second-generation immigrants, especially West Indians, and how they identify. So the middle class have typically tended to identify ethnically, while those in the working class have tended to identify more as African Americans. And so the importance of social class. However, in looking at the literature, one of the things that that I critique is that it really even though it may identify ethnic identity as important and talk about the fact that it's fluid, the literature itself doesn't really focus on the kinds of experiences that young people have that shape their identities, and the kinds of social interactions that take place, let's say, in schools, or even really the dynamic ways in which we have different social institutions, the family, schools, neighborhoods, simultaneously shaping ethnic identity over time. And so that's specifically what I'm going to be focusing on. So there are two questions that I want you to keep in mind that by the end of the presentation, I'm hoping that I will have illuminated a bit on these questions. And that is, does family social class predict whether second-generation West Indians will identify ethnically, as in I'm Jamaican, I'm Trinidadian, or as Americans? And the role of family, peers, and early schooling experiences. Just so you know what's coming ahead, I'm going to be making 3 claims throughout. And one is that I found actually that regardless of the social class backgrounds of the students that I interviewed or observed, they tended to identify ethnically. And what I'm going to associate that is really that growing concentration over time of West Indians in Brooklyn, in certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn, such that it's possible that a lot of these kids are actually interacting primarily with other second-generation West Indians, not necessarily with African Americans. And then I want to make it, kind of illustrate how this growing concentration has affected the change in identity over time. So on the first question, and I can answer questions about my methods later on in the presentation, but just so you know, I actually interviewed 24 second-generation West Indians across 2 schools, but I spent 8 months doing participant observation. So even though my interview data is based on a small group, my data overall, the patterns of observing in the schools kind of confirmed that these 24 are representative of a larger population of students. And so one important finding is that I did not find social class to be very important, because regardless of the social class backgrounds of my students, they tended to identify ethnically. And again, my observations tend to corroborate that. And so, if that's the case, why is it that we're finding such a larger proportion of second-generation West Indians identifying ethnically, regardless of their social class backgrounds? And one of the things, again, going back to the theory that I'm making a claim for, is the significance and the importance of the kinds of neighborhoods that these young people live in. And specifically when you're talking about Brooklyn, where it's possible for these kids to grow up in an environment where they're surrounded by other Caribbeans. And it's interesting because when I entered the field, you read all that other sociologists have said about your topic, and so you come up with questions based on what they found. And one of the questions I kept asking the young people in the schools was, was there any kind of tension between them and African Americans? What it would be like, what is it like, to be maybe kind of a minority per se. And they kept looking at me like I had 3 heads, like, what is your problem? So finally, I had this one kid say to me, that kind of got at the heart of it. He's like, New York, as you can tell, is full of Caribbean people, especially if you live in Brooklyn. If you live in Brooklyn, Caribbean people are always around you. And at school, it's the same way. And I think that after that, I just really stopped asking that question, because it was evidently clear, especially the more that I observed in these schools, that Caribbean culture was really this kind of had this omnipresent force in their lives. And I just have this up very quickly for those of you who may not be familiar with New York or Brooklyn. Sometimes I just say Brooklyn, but really this is it's a borough, and there's specific neighborhoods within that borough. And so even though I may just say Brooklyn, I'm really referring to specific neighborhoods where there are greater concentrations of West Indians. So I just wanted to clarify that. And I wanted to also put this concentration a bit in context, and just to show you how over time the U.S. black population and a black immigrant population has increased from, let's say, 1980 when they comprised 3.1% to 2000 when it's 4.6%. And then, you know, recognizing that in New York City, there's have such a greater concentration than in other places in the U.S. But another thing that you might take note of actually is that the percentage of West Indian immigrants in places even like Atlanta and in other places that you wouldn't typically find them have doubled, you know, in the past 10 years. And I just have this for you to get a sense of how, you know, given how the percentage has increased over time, how old the young people who I interviewed in 2003 at 16 years old, how old they were. And I started in 1992 because Mary Waters, who was very well known for doing research on West Indian immigrants, kind of collected her data around that time. But even when she collected her data, these were young people. And so in 1990, really their experiences were more shaped by what was going on in New York in the 70s and 80s, okay, or so. Late 70s and 80s. So the next point that I wanted to kind of illustrate to you then is to link this broader demographic changes, and since I have some of my students in the room, these kind of macro level changes to, you know, what's happening at the micro level that's shaping ethnic identity formation. And so one of the claims that I'm making is that there is this rising social value. Basically, it is cool now to be West Indian today than it was 10, 20 years ago, okay? And one of the ways I'm going to illustrate this is an interesting dynamic that I picked up. So in the research, one of the things that scholars talk about is how, you know, they portray the experiences of black immigrant youth as really being pressured to identify with African Americans and trying to act, you know, like American. And what is very interesting is that I actually found some instances, or at least, okay, I didn't actually observe it, but students would tell me about friends of theirs who were African Americans who would try to act like West Indians. Right? So for example, the student told me, they always have to lie and say like their parents. They'll say like, oh, my father's Jamaican. Anytime they have a conversation, you know, just to be cool and to build clout, because everybody likes Jamaicans. They want to feel like, you know, in the box. And I asked, so why is that? I don't know, maybe because they think the island is beautiful, maybe because of the black, you know, most of the black kids are West Indians and they want to fit in. I don't know, because I'm not them, right? So I thought this was an interesting indication of how what is portrayed in the literature is so different from the social reality of West Indian, you know, second generation West Indians, at least in 2003, and I'm sure even more so, you know, 2010. And so what I want to then kind of do is, again, link those macro level changes to what's happening on the ground to influence changes in identity over time, especially when these you know, kids were kind of young. And one of the things patterns that I found was as we had more and more Caribbean, like even family members migrating to the United States, and for some of these kids, they were the only ones in their family to be, you know, American, and they're just like, I don't want to be American. If everybody else is, you know, Jamaican or what have you, then that's what I want to be too. So in this case, this Guyanese young woman, when I was talking to her, she said, when I was small, you know, really I didn't care like where I came from. But as I was growing up, all my cousins are Guyanese, so I was like the first American. So I was like, why can't I be Guyanese? So when I was like turning 11, 12, like around there, I was like, I actually tried to be more Guyanese. Like if anybody asked me what I am, I told them, I'm Guyanese, right? And I thought that was really interesting because, again, thinking of one of the comments that our previous speaker talked about was the way in which even the census positions identity as this fixed thing. And this is really an example of the way in which identity is shaped and reshaped over time. So really before this, this young woman didn't really think of herself in ethnic terms. And we can see again the influx of Caribbean immigrants, you know, especially in her own family, where she's feeling like, well, I'm the one who doesn't fit in. Well, if what I have to do to fit in is to be Guyanese, well, darn it, I'm gonna be Guyanese, right? Then I wanted to give an example of changes that were occurring, not just in the family, but just in the neighborhood overall. And here we have an example of a young man who was also talking about nobody else in his family is from a different country. You know, and so he said, you know, none of them are American, so I couldn't say I'm American because it just wouldn't be right, because everybody in my family is Jamaican, so I just want to be, you know, be that too. So that's, again, kind of another, you know, illustration of this desire, to fit in with the family. In terms of then, you know, so this is kind of the family context as an institution, moving now to kind of neighborhoods/schools, and I actually mixed up my examples. This one was really interesting. This is, you know, I was thinking about his real name, I can't say it, but this young man was just really fascinating for me in this study. And so he was recounting the experience, and I like reading my quotes, so I'm gonna just go ahead. When I moved here, there were these two brothers who lived across the street. And I asked them one day, why your father talk like that? He talked mad funny to me. And they was like, oh, he from Guyana. I was like, oh, because that dude talk funny. And then when I got to junior high school, I met so many different people. And they came from Jamaica, Grenada, like everybody was coming from the Caribbean, right? And so I think this also kind of illustrates this whole sense of, you know, here's this kid, never really thought of himself as, you know, anything, you know, in terms of his ethnic identity. And he's noticing people, you know, come, you know, the neighborhood changing, accents. And even his own family actually was from Grenada and from Jamaica. But that didn't have any significance until he started, you know, started impacting him even in schools. And so it's not just, oh, here's a strange guy, you know, with a strange accent. When I'm going to school, there's more and more of these accents, you know. And so these are, for me, kind of these experiences that help to form and shape an awareness of themselves as being ethnics and distinct from, and then, you know, kind of a desire to then fit in with what was going on at the time. That said, I haven't gone into kind of how West Indians are perceived, or the change in how West Indians have been perceived, let's say in the 1980s when we were really more stigmatized because of, you know, Jamaicans and, you know, these kind of drug, their involvement in kind of, you know, drugs and so on. But one of the arguments I'm making, one of the things I'm pointing out is that the you know, West Indianness overall may be acquiring a new coolness. But Haitianness has always been even kind of more stigmatized within that. And so even when I did my research in 2003, I certainly saw evidence of this greater stigma. But one of the points I'm going to be making is that even with that, I noticed also kind of a decrease in that stigma associated with Haitianness. But I wanted to first kind of illustrate the greater stigma that's associated with being Haitian with this particular example. And so this young man, you know, Haitian was explaining, he said, you know, one of the experiences that really helped to shape, to make him aware of what it means to be Haitian and the negatives, the stigma that's associated with that. So he said, one time I was going home from school and somebody said, hey, look at that kid, he's a Haitian booty scratcher. And I was like, so Haitians are considered booty scratchers? Then I was like, I'm Haitian? Okay, I'm gonna say that. Does that make me a booty scratcher? And I'm not a booty scratcher, you know? I'm not really a bad person. So after that, I was like, I guess I'm Haitian. Right? So not, you know, kind of, you know, the best way of kind of being aware of the ways in which, you know, you are distinct from, but there are other examples of this among Haitian youth where they became actually aware of themselves as being ethnics at much earlier ages than the other West Indian groups, but because of the negative stigma and experiences that they had associated with that identity. And this is one of the, you know, the students that I was most close to, and she also talked about an experience when she was 5 or 6 years old, where people would just say bad things about Haitians, you know? And she talked about this experience where her mother was like, you know, she broke it down to her. She said, Rachel, I'm not telling you to be ashamed to be Haitian. You're proud. But because of the fact that many people are against Haitians, to make a long story short, just say that you're American, which is, you know, very sad. So it's not that, you know, within the family, it's kind of, yes, you are proud to be Haitian, but I'm very much aware of what can happen to you psychologically if you, you know, hold on publicly to this identity. And so I definitely noticed that the ethnic identity formation processes for Haitian young people were more complicated because of this greater stigma that was associated with being Haitian. That said, by the time I started doing my research, this stigma had decreased significantly from the way in which it has been described in the literature, in the academic literature. And I want to give you an example that illustrates this. And I did my research in 2 schools, and this particular school was very multi-ethnic. There's probably 35% of the population were Black and really primarily Afro-Caribbean. So I'm going to kind of read this and explain a bit more how that's illustrative. This young lady said, half of Mayfield is full of Haitians. So on Haitian Flag Day, people come around with Haitian flags and everybody's like, oh, you're Haitian? I never knew you were Haitian. But I don't really have nothing against Haitians, I have a lot of Haitian friends, and my best friend is Haitian, and her father's Haitian, so I really don't have anything against Haitians. She was really nailing that point in, right? So, for me, this is an example, one, even publicly in the schools, where Haitian Flag Day is a big deal. Everybody has a Haitian flag. And that's in part because where the school is located has a higher concentration of Haitian immigrants. But what's also, what I also want you to catch is that this young woman is saying that half of the school is full of Haitians, when really not even half of the school is Black, right? Only 35% of the school were Black. But from, one of the things that I should mention is that even though the school is very diverse, it's tracked. So you have 3 different academic programs. And the academic program that's kind of the regular program, most of the Black kids, which means most of the Afro-Caribbean kids, were concentrated in that program. So really when she's saying half of Mayfield, she's probably really talking about half of, the Black or Afro-Caribbean population. But that also goes to the point of how, schools really shape the context of ethnic identity formation. That because these young people are concentrated and they're interacting primarily with other West Indians, that has an impact on how they identify. So just to kind of, wrap things up, and then you can ask some questions. So bottom line, again, in contrast to what is typically portrayed in the literature, I didn't find that family social class had such a strong influence on ethnic identity formation. But that was in large part because of the greater concentration of West Indians in the neighborhood and in the schools in which I did my research, so that the majority of these young people, again, are interacting primarily with other West Indians, both in schools, and outside of schools. And it didn't matter, what class, what their social class background was. And then what I also, hope that you got was linking how changes in what I call kind of demographic context, that the greater numbers or proportions of West Indians coming into the United States, and linking it, especially because it's concentrated in Brooklyn, to what is happening, these larger changes, and what's happening on an individual level in terms of ethnic identity formation among these young people. And what I also hoped you got was how they both, the family and school and neighborhood environments kind of interact in very dynamic ways. They're simultaneously shaping ethnic identity, not just kind of one at a time. And so kind of, finally, again, that dynamism is what I want you to get out of this, but also when we think back to the fact that within the United States, Black people tend to be treated as a monolithic group. One of the implications of this is really to using Eduardo Bonilla Silva's concept of this collective Black identity. What this research does is to really speak to, well, what will this Black identity look like? Specifically, how will the meaning of Blackness change as we have a greater influx of not just Black Caribbeans, but other African descendant groups into the United States. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.